In the southern Syrian city of Daraa, a seemingly insignificant act of teenage defiance ignited a firestorm. It was February 2011. Inspired by the Arab Spring uprising sweeping across the region, a group of boys, barely teenagers, painted anti-government graffiti on a school wall. Their words, echoing the calls for freedom and democracy resonating from Tunisia to Egypt, were a direct challenge to the authoritarian rule of President Bashar al-Assad. Among them was 14-year-old Naif Abazid. His family had known hardship under the Assad regime. His father, a political dissident, had endured years of imprisonment. This history of oppression fueled Naif's defiance. He and his friends wanted change, and they were no longer afraid to demand it, even if it meant risking their lives. The government's response was swift and brutal. Naif and his friends were arrested, tortured, and detained. Their families, desperate for their release, were met with indifference and threats. Word of the boys' plight spread like wildfire through Daraa and beyond. What began as a local incident quickly morphed into a symbol of the regime's cruelty and the people's simmering discontent. The arrest of a few teenagers had inadvertently ignited a revolution. Daraa, once a quiet agricultural city, became the cradle of the Syrian uprising. It was here that the first sparks of rebellion were ignited, setting the stage for a nationwide movement. Outraged by the regime's treatment of the young graffiti artists who had dared to scrawl anti-government slogans on a school wall, residents took to the streets, demanding their release and an end to decades of oppressive rule. The air was thick with a sense of urgency and a long-suppressed desire for change. These initial protests were peaceful, marked by chants for freedom and dignity. The people of Daraa, like many Syrians, yearned for a life free from fear and repression. People from all walks of life, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, united in their call for change. The diversity of the protesters highlighted the widespread discontent with the regime. The government's response was immediate and ruthless. Determined to maintain its iron grip on power, security forces, heavily armed and under orders to quell any dissent, opened fire on the unarmed demonstrators. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets, a stark reminder of the regime's willingness to use violence. Live ammunition tore through the crowds, leaving behind a trail of dead and wounded. The bloodied streets bore witness to the regime's brutality. The images of the massacre, captured on mobile phones and smuggled out of the country, shocked the world. These harrowing visuals brought international attention to the plight of the Syrian people. The regime's brutality, far from crushing the protests, fueled the flames of resistance. The people of Syria, emboldened by their shared suffering, continued to rise up. As news of the Daraa massacre spread, so too did the protests. From the bustling streets of Damascus and Aleppo to the coastal city of Latakia, Syrians poured into public squares, echoing the calls for freedom that had first rung out in Daraa. The movement grew, drawing in more and more people who were determined to see an end to the regime's tyranny. The spirit of resistance was palpable. The government, however, remained steadfast in its determination to silence dissent. Arrests, torture, and extrajudicial killings became commonplace. The regime's tactics grew increasingly brutal as it sought to crush the uprising. The regime, it seemed, was willing to unleash its full might against its own people to cling to power. The Syrian people, however, remained resolute, their cries for freedom growing louder with each passing day. In the face of state-controlled media and a pervasive climate of fear, social media emerged as a lifeline for the Syrian opposition. It provided a platform where voices that were otherwise silenced could be heard, and where the truth could be shared without the heavy hand of censorship. Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube became virtual battlegrounds, where the fight for freedom and justice was waged not with weapons, but with words, images, and videos. These platforms were used to mobilize protesters, document human rights abuses, and rally international support for their cause. They broadcast the harsh realities of the conflict to a global audience, making it impossible for the world to ignore the plight of the Syrian people. Citizen journalists, armed with smartphones and laptops, filled the void left by a muzzled press, providing real-time updates and harrowing accounts of the regime's brutality. These brave individuals risked their lives to ensure that the truth was told, and their stories reached beyond the borders of Syria. The Syrian government, initially dismissive of the power of social media, quickly recognized the threat it posed to its grip on information. They saw how these platforms could undermine their control and expose their actions to the world. In response, the regime attempted to control the narrative by shutting down internet access, blocking social media platforms, and arresting those who dared to challenge its version of events online. They employed every tool at their disposal to silence dissent and maintain their hold on power. However, the digital genie was out of the bottle. The momentum of the movement could not be easily stopped. Tech-savvy activists found ways to circumvent censorship, using proxy servers, virtual private networks, VPNs, and other tools to bypass government restrictions and continue sharing their stories with the world. They adapted quickly, always staying one step ahead of the regime's efforts to silence them. The Syrian uprising marked a turning point in the use of social media in conflict. It showed how these platforms could be harnessed to mobilize resistance, expose human rights abuses, and shape international opinion. It demonstrated the power of these platforms to mobilize resistance, expose human rights abuses, and shape international opinion. The world watched as the Syrian people used social media to fight for their freedom and dignity. For the Syrian people, social media became a double-edged sword. While it amplified their voices and garnered international attention, it also exposed them to new forms of surveillance and repression. The regime, determined to maintain its grip on power, resorted to sophisticated digital tools to monitor, track, and silence dissenting voices online. They used advanced technology to keep tabs on activists and suppress any signs of rebellion. Despite these challenges, the resilience and ingenuity of the Syrian activists shone through. They continued to find ways to communicate, organize, and resist, proving that even in the darkest times, the human spirit remains unbreakable. As the protests gained momentum, so too did the brutality of the Assad regime's crackdown. Security forces employing live ammunition, tear gas, and tanks transformed peaceful demonstrations into bloodbaths. The streets, once filled with hopeful chants for change, were now scenes of chaos and carnage. Snipers perched on rooftops targeted unarmed protesters with chilling precision. Arbitrary arrests became commonplace, with thousands of Syrians disappearing into the regime's notorious network of prisons. Families were left in anguish, not knowing the fate of their loved ones. Torture, both physical and psychological, was systematically used to crush dissent and instill fear in the population. The regime's prisons became synonymous with horror, where the cries of the tortured echoed through the walls. Former detainees recounted horrific tales of beatings, electrocutions, sexual assault, and mock executions. The regime's message was clear: any opposition, no matter how peaceful, would be met with unrelenting force. The international community condemned the violence, imposing sanctions and calling for Assad to step down. Yet the regime remained defiant, continuing its campaign of terror. However, these measures proved largely ineffective in deterring the regime's brutal repression. The sanctions, while crippling the economy, did little to curb the violence on the ground. The protests continued, but so did the bloodshed. The regime's relentless violence had a profound impact on the trajectory of the Syrian uprising. What began as a peaceful movement demanding democratic reforms gradually transformed into an armed struggle for survival. The hope for a peaceful resolution faded as the conflict escalated. Many Syrians, disillusioned with the international community's failure to protect them and facing the regime's unremitting brutality, concluded that armed resistance was their only option. The Syrian conflict was on the precipice of a bloody and protracted civil war. The dreams of a better future were overshadowed by the harsh reality of a nation torn apart by violence and despair. Pause 3S. As the violence in Syria escalated, the world watched in horror. The international community was quick to condemn the Assad regime's brutal crackdown. Leaders from across the globe issued statements of outrage, calling for an immediate end to the violence and for Assad to step down. Sanctions were imposed, targeting the regime's key figures and its economic lifelines. Diplomatic efforts were made to broker peace, with the United Nations and various countries attempting to mediate the conflict. However, these efforts were often hampered by geopolitical interests and the complexities of the Syrian situation. The United Nations Security Council was frequently deadlocked, with Russia and China vetoing resolutions aimed at taking stronger action against the Assad regime. This division within the international community hindered a unified response and allowed the violence to continue unabated. Humanitarian organizations worked tirelessly to provide aid to the millions of Syrians affected by the conflict. Refugee camps sprang up in neighboring countries, hosting those who had fled the violence. Images of suffering and destruction flooded social media and news outlets, galvanizing public opinion and prompting calls for action. Despite the international outcry, tangible support for the Syrian opposition was limited. Some countries provided non-lethal aid, while others offered limited military assistance. However, this support was often fragmented and insufficient to counter the Assad regime's military capabilities, bolstered by support from allies such as Russia and Iran. The lack of decisive international intervention left many Syrians feeling abandoned by the world. The sanctions, while crippling the economy, did little to curb the violence on the ground. The conflict continued to escalate, with no end in sight. The international community's response to the Syrian crisis was marked by a mix of condemnation, humanitarian aid, and limited military support. However, these efforts were often insufficient and fragmented, failing to bring about a resolution to the conflict. The Syrian people, caught in the crossfire, continued to suffer as the world grappled with how to respond to one of the most devastating crises of the 21st century. Pause 3s. As the Syrian conflict raged on, the humanitarian crisis reached catastrophic proportions. Millions of Syrians were displaced, both internally and as refugees in neighboring countries and beyond. The United Nations estimated that over half of the Syrian population had been forced from their homes, seeking safety from the relentless violence. Pause 2s. The conditions in refugee camps were dire. Overcrowded and under-resourced, these camps struggled to provide basic necessities such as food, clean water, and medical care. Children, who made up a significant portion of the refugee population, were particularly vulnerable, facing malnutrition, disease, and a lack of access to education. Pause 2s. Inside Syria, the situation was equally grim. Cities and towns lay in ruins, with entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Hospitals and schools were frequently targeted or caught in the crossfire, depriving civilians of essential services. Humanitarian corridors, meant to allow aid to reach those in need, were often blocked or attacked, making the delivery of assistance perilous and sporadic. Pause 2s. International aid organizations and local volunteers worked tirelessly to alleviate the suffering. Despite the immense challenges, they provided food, medical care, and psychological support to the affected populations. Their efforts, however, were often hampered by the ongoing violence and the complex political landscape. Pause 2s. The resilience of the Syrian people in the face of such adversity was remarkable. Communities came together to support one another, sharing what little resources they had. Stories of hope and solidarity emerged, highlighting the strength of the human spirit even in the darkest of times. Pause 2s. Yet, the scale of the humanitarian crisis was overwhelming. The international community's response, though significant, was insufficient to meet the vast needs. As the conflict dragged on, the plight of the Syrian people served as a stark reminder of the devastating human cost of war. Pause 2s. The world watched, often feeling helpless as the crisis unfolded. The images and stories of suffering brought attention to the urgent need for a sustainable and peaceful resolution to the conflict. Until then, millions of Syrians continued to endure unimaginable hardships, holding on to hope for a brighter future. Pause 3s. The humanitarian crisis in Syria remains one of the most pressing and tragic issues of our time, a testament to the enduring resilience of the human spirit amidst the ravages of war. Pause 3s. May the world not forget their plight and work towards a future where peace and dignity are restored to the Syrian people. Pause 3s. As we look to the future of Syria, a nation ravaged by years of conflict and suffering, the path to recovery is fraught with challenges but also filled with hope. Pause 2s. Rebuilding a country torn apart by war requires not only physical reconstruction, but also healing the deep psychological wounds inflicted on its people. Pause 2s. The international community has a crucial role to play in supporting Syria's recovery, providing the necessary resources for rebuilding infrastructure, schools, and hospitals. Pause 2s. Equally important is fostering reconciliation and dialogue among the diverse communities within Syria. Peace-building efforts must prioritize inclusivity and justice to prevent future conflicts and ensure a sustainable peace. Pause 2s. The youth of Syria, who have grown up amidst the turmoil, represent a beacon of hope for the future. Investing in their education and well-being is essential to nurturing a generation capable of leading the country towards a brighter future. Pause 2s. Amid the ruins, stories of resilience and determination emerge, painting a picture of a people who refuse to be defined by their suffering. Pause 2s. International aid organizations, local NGOs, and volunteers continue their tireless work, providing not just immediate relief but also long-term support to help Syrians rebuild their lives. Pause 2s. The road ahead is undoubtedly long and arduous, but the spirit of the Syrian people combined with global solidarity can pave the way for a renewed and peaceful Syria. Pause 2s. Let us not lose sight of their courage and fortitude. May the world come together to support Syria in its journey towards healing and restoration. Pause 3s. The future of Syria lies in the hands of its people and the collective efforts of the global community. Together, we can help turn the page on this dark chapter and write a new, hopeful story for Syria. Pause 3s. May peace and dignity be restored, and may the resilience of the Syrian people shine as a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit.